Welcome to the vanished guest at Harvest Feast, a Miss Marple mystery. A joyful village feast turns dark when a guest disappears without a trace. Can Miss Marple uncover the truth before it's too late? Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. The late afternoon sun bathed the village of Little Brenton in a soft amber glow, casting long shadows across the churchyard and the tidy row of thatched cottages that lined the green. The air was alive with the scent of baked bread, apples, and wood smoke. Autumn had arrived, and with it came the annual harvest feast. By 4:30, the church hall was bustling with life. Mrs. Harriet Bletchley, a woman of commanding presence and even greater gossip, stood by the trestle tables supervising the placement of pies and puddings as though arranging troops for inspection. Her lemon sponge, she announced loudly, would likely outshine the vicar's sermon this year. Mr. Wilfred Tupper, the village's proudest, grower of marrows, muttered something about divine inspiration being a poor rival to butter and sugar. Near the far window, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles flashing in the afternoon light, listening with mild amusement. To the casual observer, she might appear to be just another elderly lady whiling away her time in harmless chatter, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing. She had already noticed that Mrs. Bletchley's sleeves were slightly flowered, proof she'd been baking herself this morning, despite claiming to have staff for such work, and that the curate's wife, Mrs. Finch, avoided looking directly at her husband since the vicar had mentioned the offering tally at Sunday service. At 5 o'clock precisely, the doors opened, and the feast began in earnest. Trays of sandwiches and cider were passed around. The brass band from neighboring Long Barton struck up a cheerful tune, and the townsfolk laughed with the easy warmth that came from good food, and the illusion that all was right with the world. Then came the guest of honor, a man whose arrival caused more than one whispered exchange among the villagers. "Colonel Statham," announced Mrs. Bletchley with the gravity of one introducing royalty, retired from the Indian Army, staying at the Laurels. The colonel, tall and silver-haired, made his entrance with the practiced dignity of a man accustomed to attention. His accent carried the clipped authority of the British Raj, though his eyes were restless, scanning the crowd as though measuring each face. He greeted the vicar, praised the apple chutney, and accepted a glass of cider with the air of someone performing a social duty. Miss Marple observed him keenly from her corner. His cufflinks, small, engraved with a crest she did not immediately recognize, were subtly mismatched. One gold, one brass. His left hand bore a faint mark, where a ring had recently been removed, and though he smiled readily enough, his smile never seemed to reach his eyes. "He's not local," said Mrs. Bletchley, plonking herself beside Miss Marple. "Came down a fortnight ago. Said he wanted peace and quiet. Between you and me, he's been asking an awful lot of questions for someone seeking solitude." "What kind of questions?" Miss Marple asked mildly, not looking up from her knitting. "Oh, about the old Holloway estate sold after the war, and about Miss Lydia Brown, who used to live there, died suddenly, you remember, right before they sold it. Heart, they said, though some of us always thought, well." She left the rest hanging in the air, tantalizingly unfinished. The evening carried on, laughter mingling with the strains of a waltz. Yet there was something in the atmosphere, a tension Miss Marple could not quite name. It was as if beneath the surface gaiety, some unspoken awareness pulsed among the guests. Shortly before dusk, Colonel Statham was seen stepping outside for air. He crossed the churchyard, his figure silhouetted against the fading gold of the sky, and disappeared toward the yew trees that bordered the vicarage garden. Several people noticed. One or two even called after him. But when the pudding course was served half an hour later, he had not returned. At first, it was taken lightly. Perhaps he lost his way, joked Mr. Tupper, but when the band stopped playing and the vicar suggested they begin the closing hymn, an unease began to ripple through the crowd. The colonel had been expected to give a brief word of thanks. His absence was conspicuous. Mrs. Bletchley, ever alert to a scene, dispatched her nephew Peter to look for him. The boy came back pale-faced. "He's not in the churchyard, Auntie," he stammered. "I called and called, but he's gone." The gate to the old Holloway path was open. That path had long been considered unlucky, an overgrown lane leading toward the ruins of Holloway Lodge, where Miss Lydia Brown had Fifedings died 5 years earlier. Few villagers ventured there after dark. The vicar frowned, glancing toward the door. "We mustn't alarm anyone unnecessarily," he began. But even as he spoke, a faint breeze swept through the hall, rattling the unlatched window pane. It was an oddly chilling sound. Miss Marple rose quietly, setting down her knitting. "Perhaps," she said gently, "it might be best if someone fetched a lantern and had another look. People rarely vanish without reason." Her calm tone carried more weight than any alarm might have done. A small search party was quickly formed. Mr. Tupper, the vicar, young Peter, and 2 of the band members, all carrying lanterns. The others remained inside, voices dropping to anxious murmurs. 15 minutes later they returned without the colonel. "He's not on the path," said Mr. Tupper breathlessly. "We looked as far as the gate to Holloway Lodge. Nothing. No footprints, no sound, nothing." Mrs. Finch crossed, herself. Then, where on earth could he have gone? The question hung in the air. The colonel had not come back for his hat or his coat. His walking stick still leaned against the wall near the door. Miss Marple studied the items quietly. The stick's silver handle bore the same crest as the mismatched cufflink, a rearing horse beneath a crown. Her fingers brushed the worn wood, and she noticed a small dark smear on the base mud, but not the kind from Little Brenton's soft fields. This was heavier, with the scent of iron and stone. The vicar was attempting to calm his parishioners when Mrs. Bletchley suddenly gasped. "Look!" she cried, pointing toward the window. "The lanterns by the yew trees they're swinging, but there's no one there." Indeed, 2 of the lanterns, left behind by the searchers, now moved faintly back and forth, as if stirred by unseen hands. The crowd pressed forward, faces pale, eyes wide. Miss Marple alone remained still. Her expression was thoughtful, not fearful. "Strange," she murmured to herself. "Very strange. The yew trees don't move much in calm weather, and yet they're moving tonight." No one saw the small smile that crossed her lips then, or the subtle glint of understanding that flickered in her eyes. For Miss Marple, the mystery had already begun, not with the disappearance of Colonel Statham, but with the faint echo of something older, deeper, and far less accidental. By morning, Little Brenton was a village transformed. The golden calm of harvest had been replaced by a restless whispering that darted through lanes and gardens like an autumn wind. From the bakery to the post office, everyone had something to say about Colonel Statham's disappearance, though no 2 stories matched. Some claimed he'd been seen near the church gate after dusk. Others insisted he'd never left the hall at all. A few those fond of tales spoke of lights moving near Holloway Lodge long after midnight. At the Bluebell Tea Room, the hub of village talk, Miss Marple sat at her usual table by the window, quietly stirring her tea. She listened without comment as Mrs. Bletchley held court among the morning customers, her voice pitched just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mark my words," she declared. "That man didn't vanish into thin air. There's always a reason when people disappear, especially those with secrets. And he had them. You could see it plain as day." Miss Marple nodded absently, eyes fixed on the street outside where the constable, young Mr. Pritchard, was questioning the vicar. He looked terribly earnest, his notebook trembling slightly in his hand. Miss Marple recalled that the vicar's sermon the previous Sunday had been on the subject of truth. He'd spoken of light revealing darkness, a notion that now, perhaps, struck a little too close to home. Mrs. Bletchley leaned across the table, lowering her voice dramatically. "They say his room at the Laurels was locked from the inside this morning. Window shut too. Yet his bed hadn't been slept in. Only his suitcase missing, nothing else. Tell me, Miss Marple, what do you make of that?" "Oh," said Miss Marple, smiling gently. "It reminds me of something that happened to my nephew's friend in Devon. He vanished one evening as well. Turned out he hadn't vanished at all, he'd merely gone where no one thought to look." The comment, delivered so mildly, silenced Mrs. Bletchley for nearly 10 seconds, a remarkable feat. Then she sniffed and declared that no one in Little Brenton could simply vanish unless foul play were involved, which earned several approving nods. Outside, a carriage drew up in front of the Laurels. A tall man in a dark overcoat stepped down, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. Miss Marple watched as he greeted Constable Pritchard with a firm handshake and a London accent. Word spread swiftly. Inspector Graves had arrived from county headquarters. By afternoon, the inspector was making inquiries across the village. He had the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to results. His manner was polite, but sharp, his questions leaving people flustered and defensive. At the church hall, he examined the grounds himself, pacing slowly from the door to the edge of the yew trees. "No footprints," he muttered. "Ground too firm. And that gate to Holloway Path recently oiled." The vicar blinked. "Oiled? I hadn't noticed." "No," said the inspector quietly. "I expect you hadn't." Miss Marple, standing a few yards away, heard the exchange and made a small, thoughtful sound in her throat. Gates did not oil themselves. After all, someone had taken the trouble quite recently, and that suggested preparation. That evening, the inspector stopped by Miss Marple's cottage, having been advised that no one in the village knew its people better. He found her by the fire, knitting as always, with a faint smile that made him feel both welcomed and slightly examined. "I understand you were at the harvest feast, Miss Marple," he began. "Did you notice anything unusual before the colonel stepped out?" "Unusual," she repeated, as though considering the word carefully. "Well, there was that little business with Mrs. Finch and the plum pudding, though perhaps that's not relevant." He raised an eyebrow. "What business?" She appeared quite flustered when she realized the colonel had taken the slice meant for her husband. Miss Marple said mildly, "One might think it nothing, of course, but I always find small embarrassments more revealing than large quarrels. They tend to show what people wish to conceal." The inspector frowned, uncertain whether to take her seriously. "You believe the colonel's disappearance has to do with something local, then?" "I believe," said Miss Marple softly, setting down her knitting, "that people rarely disappear, unless they have either something to hide or something to fear." Graves regarded her curiously, perhaps amused by the quiet certainty in her tone. "And which do you think applies here?" "Oh, both, I imagine," she replied with a faint smile. "Though the real question, Inspector, is which belongs to whom?" When he had gone, Miss Marple sat a moment longer, listening to the wind outside. Somewhere beyond the cottages, in the shadow of the yew trees, a single lantern still hung forgotten, its glass glinting faintly in the moonlight. She watched it flicker through the window, thoughtful and calm, knowing that in Little Brenton, where nothing ever truly stayed buried, the truth was already stirring beneath the autumn leaves. Dawn laid a thin mist along the hedgerows and the church spire, turning Little Brenton into something half-remembered. Inspector Graves began at the Laurels. Miss Marple, walking to the post, paused while he questioned Mrs. Alder, the landlady, whose shawl was fastened crookedly, as if thrown on in haste. Mrs. Alder insisted Colonel Statham ate lightly, paid 2 days ahead, asked for a local map. His suitcase was gone, his bed unslept, the door locked, the window painted shut. On the washstand lay a neat handkerchief, and the faintest glint of something brittle when Mrs. Alder lifted the cloth. A dried marigold petal flicked away like a mote of sunlight. Graves examined the lock, noting faint scratches around the plate, as though someone clumsy had turned it with an improvised tool. "Either he returned after the feast," he said, "or someone wants us to think so." Miss Marple, in the doorway, noticed a pale, gritty smear along the skirting board, the dust of old stone, not coal from the Laurel's scuttle. By noon, the inspector had charted the colonel's days. Solitary walks at odd hours, questions about the Holloway estate, A discreet inquiry at the parish register concerning Miss Lydia Brown's sudden death. The grocer he had bought stamps, cider, and a length of string. "String is honest," Miss Marple observed later, pouring tea for Graves. "It tells you whether something has been bundled together." He produced the mismatched cufflinks recovered from the cloakroom. Gold and brass. Crest matches his stick. Why would a precise man wear an odd pair? Because he lost one suddenly, Miss Marple said. Or because he lent one purposefully. Some men are sentimental about pairs, others about proofs. They walked to the yews. The abandoned lantern still hung, the gate hinge glossy with recent oil. A pale fibre clung to the run of oil. Miss Marple folded it in paper. "From a cuff or scarf," she murmured. "Not his tweed. The nap is wrong." On the grass where the lanterns had swung were bruises without prints, as if boards had been laid and lifted. The mineral smell persisted: iron, damp, stone. Cellar earth, she thought. Or a well mouth. The Holloway path showed little until, just beyond the yews, the hedge offered a narrow side gap toward the vicarage orchard. "A suggestion rather than a trail," Miss Marple said. "People follow where light invites them." Back in the nave, Mrs. Finch was folding hymn sheets when Graves approached. She flushed, scattering paper. "He admired our choir loft," she said, eyes fixed on the font. "Asked if the view was instructive for seeing who speaks to whom. I thought it odd." The loft yielded a small relic. On the rail, a tack mark where something square had been fixed and removed. In the groove, a pin of red sealing wax. Graves pocketed it. A notice? Or a message left to be taken? Afternoon cooled. Miss Marple returned to her roses and considered the ring mark on the colonel's finger. The prepaid bill, the marigold petal, the oiled hinge, the pale fibre, the string, the bruised grass, the side gap. People seldom hide truth. They arrange it to be seen in the wrong order. She, I.D., Avrima, remembered a charwoman who concealed savings by leaving a decoy purse in plain sight. Footsteps hurried along the lane. Peter Bletchley arrived breathless, cap askew. "Miss Marple, Inspector, please come to the mill pond. Under the old footbridge there's a coat. Not a body." He swallowed. "A gentleman's coat, weighted with stones. A letter in the pocket. At the pond, the willow branches curtained the water. Graves drew the coat from the reeds. The colonel's tweed, the rearing horse crest stitched inside. In one pocket lay a small parcel of pebbles. In another, a folded sheet closed with red wax, broken and resealed. Graves opened it. Inside was a village map, marked with 3 crosses in firm pencil. The yew gate, the choir loft, and the old well behind Holloway Lodge. Miss Marple watched ripples diminish to a glassy circle. 3 points make a triangle, she said. Triangles frame pictures or direct sightlines. Graves studied the map. If this is genuine, he planned to meet someone at the well. If it's false, someone planned for us to think he did. Either way, Miss Marple replied, the well will tell us what the feast would not. The old well behind Holloway Lodge stood, choked with ivy, and half a century of silence. Its stone lip was mottled with moss, and the chain of the bucket hung rusted and motionless. Inspector Graves leaned over the crumbling edge, lowering his lantern. The light slid down the rough stones and vanished into darkness. The air that drifted up was cool and faintly metallic. Miss Marple, standing a few paces back, noted the disturbed nettles near the wall flattened in 2 directions, as though 2 people had come and gone separately. Couldn't have drawn water from this for years, Graves muttered. Depths good, 30 feet, nothing visible below. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the wooden cover propped carelessly against a hedge. It was old, but not untouched, its hinges recently oiled, its edge clean where someone's hand had gripped it. People don't oil what they mean to abandon, she said quietly. The inspector turned toward the lodge itself, a ruin, its roof caved, windows black as blind eyes. They entered through the front, the floorboards creaking beneath them. Dust lay thick, but a faint line of footprints crossed the hall, too narrow for boots, too deliberate for chance. Graves crouched. Woman's tread, I'd say. Small foot, steady pace. Miss Marple nodded. Mrs. Finch, perhaps, or someone who wears her size to look like her. He frowned. You suspect her? I suspect no one, she replied. I observe only that appearances in villages are like lace lovely from afar, full of holes when studied close. A noise came from the back room, a slow drip, the sound of something hollow catching water. Graves drew his torch beam across the floor and froze. The beam settled on a patch of pale cloth among the find. Debris, a scarf. Torn at one end, its fabric fine wool. Miss Marple bent to pick it up, brushing away the dust. A small strand of blue thread caught in her glove, matching precisely the pale fiber she had found on the oiled gate. When they returned to the church hall later that afternoon, a small crowd had gathered despite Graves's request for privacy. The word body had already found its way into whispers, though no body had yet been found. Mrs. Bletchley stood near the door, clearly thriving on the attention, while Mrs. Finch sat apart, pale and tight-lipped. Her husband, the curate, spoke softly to her, but she would not meet his eye. Graves questioned her gently. You knew Colonel Statham, Mrs. Finch? Only in passing, she said. He was polite, too polite. The sort of man who says kind things but listens too carefully. Did you meet him before the feast? She hesitated, glancing toward the vicar. Once. He came to ask about the Holloway property, something about Miss Lydia Brown's will. I told him. I knew nothing. Her voice trembled faintly. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved quietly in her lap. Forgive an old woman's curiosity, she said softly. But you do remind me of someone who's recently come into a bit of money, new gloves. Finer than last month. One wonders, of course, whether Miss Brown might have remembered you kindly in her will after all. Mrs. Finch flinched, then caught herself. You're mistaken, Miss Marple. My gloves were a gift from my husband. The curate blinked at that, startled. The silence that followed said more than words could. When the Finches had gone, Graves exhaled. She's hiding something. Yes, Miss Marple said, winding her wool neatly. But guilt and fear are twins, often confused for one another. Still, that scarf of hers, or one quite like it, was at Holloway Lodge. We must discover whether she lost it or left it. By evening, the mist had thickened, swallowing the cottages in damp grey light. Miss Marple walked home alone, the scent of wet leaves and wood smoke drifting through the air. From the vicarage window she glimpsed a movement, a figure drawing the curtains quickly, as though not wishing to be seen. At her own gate she paused. Something small lay on the path. A single brass cufflink, engraved with a rearing horse. She turned it over in her hand, feeling the cold metal against her palm. The missing match to the Colonel's gold one. She looked back toward the church tower rising in the fog, her expression unreadable. Not lost, she murmured, almost to herself. Placed. The wind stirred the yew trees, and somewhere far off a dog barked once, sharply, before the night folded in again, carrying with it the uneasy promise that the truth, though buried deep, was beginning to rise. The following morning dawned grey and heavy, a drizzle softening the edges of Little Brenton. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, the brass cufflink resting beside her teacup. The rearing horse gleamed faintly, its surface newly polished. She turned it between her fingers, thinking not of its value, but of intent. Whoever had placed it on her path had wanted it found. The question was, why her? A knock sounded at the door. It was Inspector Graves, his expression troubled. They've dredged the old well, he said without preamble. No body, only this. He handed her a small parcel, wrapped in damp brown paper. Inside was a woman's purse, the initials M.F., faintly embossed in gilt. The clasp was broken, the contents soaked, but one thing remained clear, a pressed marigold, flattened between the folds of a letter fragment. Miss Marple's eyes flicked up. "Mrs. Finch," she murmured. Graves nodded. "And yet Mrs. Finch insists she's never been near the lodge. Claims she lost her purse days ago at the market. Her husband confirms it, or tries to. But his story shifts every time I ask." He paced to the window, his breath misting the glass. "And there's more. Colonel Statham wasn't who he said he was. No record of him under that name. But there was a Captain Statham, dismissed from the army 15 years ago under suspicion of theft." Miss Marple poured him tea, her movements calm, unhurried. "So our colonel was a man accustomed to vanishing when the truth approached. Yet something brought him here to a quiet village and an old death." She paused. "Did you find anything else at the well?" He hesitated. "Yes. A handkerchief, plain white, with a faint trace of blue ink, perhaps from a pen leak. The same sort Mrs. Finch gives out at the church bazaar. Her initials, too." Outside, the rain thickened. Miss Marple watched the drops slide down the window like thin trails of thought. "Ink," she said softly. "Strange how it betrays what words conceal." By midday, the inspector was at the vicarage again, this time officially. The Finches sat together on the sofa, though the air between them was brittle. Mrs. Finch's hands twisted her handkerchief, while her husband spoke for them both. "You must believe us," he said. "We've done nothing wrong. The colonel came here on his own business, something about an inheritance. He claimed Lydia Brown's estate had been mishandled. My wife only told him what anyone might." "Did he threaten you?" Graves asked. Mrs. Finch shook her head quickly. "No. Only he seemed to know things. About us. About money. About—" She stopped, color draining from her face. The inspector leaned forward. "About what, Mrs. Finch?" Her husband's hand closed over hers. "That's enough," he said sharply. "My wife has been unwell. This questioning." Miss Marple, seated in the corner by the fire, looked up from her knitting. "Forgive me," she said gently, "but the truth, once spoken, tends to relieve far more pain than it causes, especially when it's been waiting 5 years. The curate stiffened. "You mean Miss Brown's death?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "A kind woman, by all accounts, but one who lent money privately, sometimes unwisely. I believe she lent to you, Mr. Finch. And when repayment proved difficult, she made provision for the debt in her will. But the will was altered, wasn't it? The signature forged, perhaps, or replaced. A small deception, one easy to hide until someone began asking questions." Mrs. Finch gave a low cry, pressing her hands to her face. Her husband rose suddenly. "You have no proof of that?" Graves' voice was steady. "Perhaps not yet, but the colonel, whatever his name truly was, had reason to expose it. He may have confronted one of you last night by the well." The curate's face was pale now, almost waxen. "You're saying I killed him?" Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "I'm saying that someone feared what he might reveal and staged his disappearance to look like murder. But they made one mistake. They forgot that guilt leaves traces not of blood, but of care. The oiled gate, the placed cufflink, the purse returned to the water. Those aren't acts of panic, they're acts of arrangement." Graves frowned. "So he isn't dead?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "No, Inspector. I think the colonel or captain planned his own vanishing. And someone helped him without realizing it. Outside, the rain had stopped. A thin shaft of light pierced the clouds and fell across the brass cufflink on her table, setting the horse ablaze. "It's all very neat," she said softly. "But neatness is never natural in Little Brenton. Let us see who benefits from his absence, then we shall know who truly wanted him gone." Evening shadows stretched long across the green as the village began to stir again, though in cautious whispers rather than laughter. News of the colonel's false identity had spread, yet no one quite knew what to make of it. Some claimed he had been a criminal seeking refuge. Others, an investigator from London, Only Miss Marple seemed entirely untroubled by speculation, her calm eyes seeing far beyond the chatter. Inspector Graves met her outside the churchyard, the air damp with the scent of rain-soaked earth. "He's still gone," he said shortly. "No trace of him boarding a train or hiring a carriage. I've checked every station within 10 miles. If he planned his own vanishing, he did it too well." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes, Inspector, people disappear not by running away, but by hiding where everyone is too polite to look." He frowned, not quite grasping her meaning. "You think he's still here?" "I think," she said gently, "that his purpose in coming here has not yet been fulfilled, and men of purpose rarely leave work unfinished." Their path led toward the laurels once more. The drizzle had stopped, but puddles gleamed like ink in the road. The curtains were drawn, yet a thin glow showed through the parlor window. Mrs. Alder opened the door before they knocked, her face pale. "You'll want to see his room again," she whispered. "I didn't touch anything, but someone's been in there since morning." Inside, the room bore subtle changes. The handkerchief on the washstand was gone. The Colonel's walking stick had shifted an inch to the left, and on the windowsill, half hidden behind the curtain, lay a scrap of notepaper damp with condensation. Graves unfolded it carefully. The writing was faint but distinct, 3 words in hurried pencil. "Tell the vicar." The inspector looked up sharply. "Tell him what?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Not what, Inspector. That. It's an instruction, not a question." He wanted someone to tell the vicar that something had been done. Graves exhaled. "Then we're back to the Finches." By twilight, they stood once more in the vicarage garden. The lamps were unlit. The windows glowed faintly with firelight. The curate opened the door himself, composed but hollow-eyed. "Inspector," he said stiffly, "my wife is resting. If you've more questions, I'd prefer you address them to me." Graves held out the note. "Recognize the handwriting?" The curate took it, studying the smudged pencil lines. "No. Should I?" Miss Marple, standing by the hearth, watched his reflection flicker in the glass. "Perhaps," she said, "if you've ever received a letter from your late parishioner, Miss Lydia Brown. I believe this matches her hand, though more tremulous." The curate's composure cracked. "Impossible. She's been dead 5 years." Miss Marple's knitting bag hung loosely at her side. "And yet," she said softly, "someone has gone to great trouble to make it appear as if she still had something left to say." A sharp sound came from the staircase. Mrs. Finch stood there, pale and trembling, a candle shaking in her grasp. "Stop it," she said hoarsely. "Please stop. You don't understand." Her husband turned to her, startled. "Mary." "She came to me," Mrs. Finch blurted. "Not Lydia, but him. The Colonel. He said he'd found a letter in her Bible, proof that we'd changed the will. He said he'd expose it unless we confessed. I was terrified. I only wanted to talk to him, to beg him not to ruin us. But he never came to the church that night like he promised." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "No," she said gently, "because someone else met him first. Someone who knew about that note, the one that said, 'Tell the vicar.' Perhaps he trusted the wrong confidant." The curate's voice was low. "Are you accusing me, Miss Marple?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm observing, Mr. Finch, that when a man builds his life on half-truths, even honesty sounds like deceit. You've been afraid not of the Colonel's death, but of his return." Thunder murmured faintly beyond the hills. Mrs. Finch sank into a chair, weeping quietly. The curate turned away, his face shadowed. "If he's alive," he whispered, "then where is he now?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the church tower outside the window, dark against the sky. "Somewhere close," she murmured. "Somewhere he could listen and watch until he knows the truth is safe. We should begin at the choir loft." The wind sighed through the eaves of Bartholomew's as Miss Marple and Inspector Graves entered the church once more. The vast interior was cloaked in dimness, the faint scent of wax and dust lingering in the air. Lantern light wavered across the pews, and somewhere above, A board creaked softly in the loft. Miss Marple looked up, her expression calm but alert. "People rarely think of a church as a hiding place," she murmured. "And that's precisely why it serves so well as Nota. 1." They climbed the narrow stair to the choir loft, their steps echoing lightly on the worn wood. The shadows deepened as the inspector lifted his lantern. The air was colder up there, edged with the scent of damp stone. Dust motes danced in the weak light, and a faint rustling broke the silence. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Miss Marple moved closer to the far end, where the rail overlooked the nave. Her fingers brushed against something rough cloth, a bundle pushed beneath the bench. Graves crouched beside her and pulled it free. It was a coat, the same tweed that had been found by the mill pond, but dry this time, the inner pocket holding a folded paper. He opened it carefully, the lantern trembling in his hand. "Good Lord," he whispered. "It's a confession." Miss Marple took the page, reading silently. The handwriting was uneven but familiar Captain Statham's. It spoke of deception, of a false identity taken to uncover an old crime, of a forged will, and a promise broken. But it stopped abruptly halfway down the page, ending with a single, unfinished line. "I fear she suspects, but it is too late." "She?" Graves repeated. "Who did he mean?" Miss Marple folded the letter neatly. "We must be careful, Inspector. The dead cannot amend their statements, but the living can make good use of them." She turned toward the rafters. The faintest sound drifted down a breath, a shifting weight. Graves motioned for silence. He lifted the lantern higher, and the beam found a figure crouched behind the organ pipes, blinking in the sudden light. It was Colonel Statham, or what was left of the man who had called himself that. His face was pale, gaunt, his hair damp with sweat. He blinked at them as though emerging from a dream. "Good heavens," Graves said, stepping forward. "You're alive." The man's voice was hoarse. "Barely. I hadn't meant to vanish quite so thoroughly, but when one's informant turns out to be one's enemy, it becomes prudent to disappear before they can finish the job." Miss Marple regarded him gently. "You were attacked, then?" He gave a faint smile. "Warned off, rather. A shove near the well, nothing more. I managed to crawl away and hide. I knew if I stayed missing long enough, the guilty would reveal themselves." His eyes flicked toward the church door. "Has she?" Graves frowned. "If you mean Mrs. Finch, she's confessed to meeting you, yes, but claims no harm. Her husband, on the other hand." The colonel's expression hardened. "Ah, the reverend gentleman, a most accomplished forger, if my sources were correct. I came to Little Brenton not for revenge, Miss Marple, but for justice. Miss Brown's estate was stolen by trust and deceit, hidden beneath piety. The proof was in her Bible, and the vicar removed it before the burial." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And you found it?" He nodded. "I did, but not before someone else found me." A noise below cut him short, the church door opening, the muffled tread of footsteps on stone. Graves doused the lantern. In the dimness, they heard the careful slide of wood against metal, a lock turning. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "He's come back to make sure the past stays buried." The inspector's hand moved to his revolver. They waited, breathless, as the steps grew louder, nearer. Then the curate appeared at the base of the stair, his face ghostly in the weak moonlight. "Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said softly, "you've saved us the trouble of sending for you." His gaze darted to the colonel, then to Graves, then to Miss Marple. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he spoke, his voice trembling but defiant. "He ruined us once already. He was going to do it again. You don't understand. Lydia wanted it this way. She pitied us." Miss Marple's tone was calm, almost pitying. "No, Mr. Finch. She pitied your wife. You chose pride. Over repentance, and pride, as I've often found, is the surest accomplice of folly." The curate's shoulders sagged, the last of his defiance draining away. The sound of the church bell struck midnight, slow, solemn, echoing through the hollow air. When it faded, only silence remained, broken at last by Miss Marple's quiet sigh. "It's always the same in the end," she said softly. "Sin is rarely loud, Inspector. It whispers until someone listens closely enough to hear it." The curate stood frozen at the foot of the stair, his face as pale as the marble font beside him. For a long, taut moment, no one moved. The faint echo of the midnight bell still hung in the air like the last toll of judgment. Colonel Statham, weak but alert, straightened slightly in the shadows, his voice a rasp of exhaustion and accusation. "You took what wasn't yours, Finch. You and your wife forged Miss Brown's will, sold her home, buried her name beneath your sermons." The curate's eyes flickered to Miss Marple. Then, to the inspector, "You don't understand. We were drowning in debt, my wife's illness, the church roof, the endless demands of charity. Miss Brown would have ruined us if I hadn't," his voice faltered, "if I hadn't altered a few words." "Altered," Miss Marple repeated softly, stepping forward until her face caught the faint light from the window. "A gentle word for a crime, Mr. Finch. You thought yourself justified, as so many sinners do when they convince themselves God approves their convenience." He turned on her suddenly, the strain breaking through his composure. "And what do you know of it? You sit in judgment, knitting and whispering as if you understand temptation." "Temptation?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Oh yes, I've seen it. In the gardener who kept a little from the collection box to buy his son boots. In the maid who opened a letter not meant for her and ruined a Flucker family. I've seen good people undone by the smallest lie. But I've also seen how one deception breeds another and another until a man can't tell his faith from his fear." The inspector's tone cut through the tension. "Enough, Finch. You'll have your say in court." But the curate barely seemed to hear him. His gaze had fallen on the colonel, whose presence, ghostly and unyielding, seemed to drag the truth from him. "You think you've won," Finch whispered, "but you've no proof left. You said yourself the Bible was the key. You'll never find it now." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained mild. "Won't we?" He hesitated, and that hesitation betrayed him. His hand twitched just a fraction toward the altar beyond the nave. Miss Marple's gaze followed it. "Ah," she said gently, "of course. You wouldn't destroy a sacred book, not outright. But hide it? Yes. Where better than the house of God itself? Graves." Caught the meaning and moved quickly down the stairs, lanterns sweeping across the pews. The curate made a sudden motion, perhaps to stop him, perhaps in despair. But Miss Marple's firm hand on his arm stilled him. "It's over, Mr. Finch. The truth, you see, never stays buried long. It simply waits for a quieter moment to be heard." The inspector reached the altar and knelt before the carved wooden lectern. Beneath it, behind the draped cloth, his lantern's glow caught the corner of something wrapped in linen. He drew it out slowly, a heavy Bible, its cover worn smooth, its pages faintly swollen from damp. As he opened it, a folded parchment slipped free, yellowed with age. The handwriting within was delicate, precise, and entirely unlike the curate's. Miss Marple descended the steps, her eyes resting on the parchment. "Miss Lydia Brown's original will," she said softly, "unaltered, and look witnessed by 2 signatures. She left everything to the parish orphan fund, not the vicarage." The curate gave a strangled sound, half sob, half confession. "I meant to put it back," he muttered, "after the debts were cleared, after the roof was repaired. It was never meant to hurt anyone." "But it did," Miss Marple replied quietly. "It hurt your conscience, your marriage, your peace, and when the colonel came to uncover it, you mistook justice for punishment. You feared exposure more than forgiveness, and that fear made you dangerous." The colonel stepped forward, his weariness replaced by grim composure. "He tried to warn me away at the well," he said to Graves. "Said the village didn't need more scandal. When I refused to go, He shoved me. I might have drowned had the stones not caught the chain. I pretended to flee, knowing he'd damn himself by trying to hide what he'd done. Graves nodded slowly, eyes never leaving Finch. And you were right. The curate sank onto the bottom step of the pulpit, face buried in his hands. You can't understand, he whispered. The shame, the pity. I couldn't bear to see her, my wife, destroyed. I only wanted to protect her. Protection built on deceit, Miss Marple said softly, is the kind that collapses the moment truth knocks at the door. Outside, the first faint streaks of dawn touched the stained glass windows, turning the figures of saints into silhouettes of crimson and gold. Miss Marple looked up at the light filtering through the painted panes. It seems, she said gently, morning comes to all sins in time. The inspector signaled 2 constables waiting outside. They entered silently, the shuffle of boots echoing against the stone. Mr. Finch rose unsteadily, surrendering without protest. As they led him away, he paused by Miss Marple. You speak of forgiveness, he said in a low voice. Do you think there's any left for me? She looked at him sadly. That is between you and God, Mr. Finch. But I've always found that he's kinder to those who stop lying to themselves. When the door closed behind them, silence settled again, broken only by the rustle of Miss Marple's knitting bag as she gathered her things. Colonel Statham leaned wearily against a pew. You've saved my life, he said simply. Oh no, she replied with a faint smile. You did that yourself by having the good sense to stay hidden. I only reminded the truth where to look. Graves exhaled, relief softening his usual briskness. You've a remarkable gift, Miss Marple. Not a gift, Inspector, she said. Just the habit of noticing what others dismiss as unimportant. People, after all, give themselves away, not in their great actions, but in their smallest. As they stepped out into the fresh dawn, the village lay still beneath a veil of mist. The yew trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with dew, and a single bell tolled softly for morning prayers. Miss Marple paused, at the gate, glancing back at the church tower. Poor Mr. Finch, she murmured. He forgot that even the gentlest lies cast the longest shadows, and with that, she turned toward home, her steps steady on the damp lane. The first light of day, glinting faintly on the brass cufflink, she had slipped back into her pocket, a quiet reminder of yet another human tragedy unraveled, and of how, in every village, the truth waits patiently for someone kind enough and clever enough to notice it. The following day broke clear and windless, as though the village itself were holding its breath after the night's revelations. A pale sun glimmered on the dew-soaked hedges, and the faint toll of the church bell drifted over Little Brenton, slower than usual, almost hesitant. Inside her neat sitting room, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting untouched on her lap, her gaze distant. Though the culprit was in custody and the will recovered, something in the affair still tugged at her mind, a faint, incomplete thread. It was not, she thought, that the curate's guilt was in doubt. Rather, it was the shape of what had not yet been said that unsettled her. Inspector Graves arrived mid-morning, his coat unbuttoned, his expression weary but thoughtful. The colonel's statement will hold, he said, sitting opposite her. Finch confessed again this morning, says he only meant to frighten the man. But we both know how that ends once the truth begins to close in. He'll likely plead guilty to forgery and attempted assault. Miss Marple nodded, though her eyes remained on the flames. And Mrs. Finch? She's gone to stay with her sister in Devon. Claims she knew nothing of the forgery, though her purse at the well says otherwise. I imagine she'll be pitied by the parish before the week's out. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. Villages have short memories for the guilty, and long ones for the scandal. She paused, frowning faintly. And what of Colonel Statham? Or Captain Statham, Graves corrected with a wry smile. He's leaving this evening. Said he's had enough of mysteries for one lifetime. The vicarage funds and Miss Brown's charity will be restored, so all's tidy again. Tidy, Miss Marple repeated softly, as though tasting the word and finding it unsatisfying. Yes, perhaps too tidy. Graves looked at her sharply. You think there's more to it? She gave a small, thoughtful sigh. Not more. Inspector, just not right. You see, when things arrange themselves so neatly, I've learned to look for the hand that placed them. And in this case, I suspect that hand was not the curate's. He frowned. But Finch confessed. Yes, yes, she said quickly, her voice mild but firm. Men confess to what they believe they've done, not always to what they truly have. Tell me, Inspector, did it not strike you as strange that Captain Statham, an ex-officer and investigator, managed to vanish, plant evidence, and reappear precisely when the noose was tightening, all without a single soul noticing? And that his proofs of Miss Brown's will surfaced exactly where he alone could find them? Graves leaned back, uncertain. You're suggesting he staged the whole thing? Not entirely, Miss Marple replied. He came here for a reason of that, I've no doubt. But the matter of the forged will and Miss Brown's charity was known only to a very small circle. Someone must have told him before he arrived. Someone who stood to gain from seeing the Finches ruined. The inspector's brow furrowed. You mean Mrs. Bletchley? She's the only one nosy enough. Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, not Mrs. Bletchley. Gossip is careless. But this was surgical. The Colonel's arrival, the well, the missing purse, the conveniently placed cufflink, it was all too carefully arranged for mere chance. Someone guided his suspicion, step by step, until it pointed precisely where they wanted. She rose slowly, moving to the window. Outside, a solitary figure was crossing the green toward the inn. Colonel Statham, valise in hand, his gait brisk, despite the walking stick he leaned upon. He's leaving rather soon, don't you think? Before the dust has settled, before the Finch's story has faded. That is not the act of a man seeking justice, it's the act of one who's taken all he came for. Graves followed her gaze. You believe he's after money? Not money, she said softly. Something more practical, documents, perhaps. Or perhaps simply the satisfaction of seeing a rival undone. A rival? Miss Marple turned, her eyes alight with quiet certainty. You said Captain Statham was dismissed from the army for theft. What sort of theft? He blinked. Forgery of signatures, if I recall. Letters of recommendation. He faked orders to cover debts. She nodded, slowly. How very interesting. Then, the man who exposed a forgery was himself a forger. And what better way to clear one's name than to frame another with a similar sin? Redemption, Inspector, can be a dangerous motive. Graves stared at her, speechless. Good Lord! You think he came not to uncover the crime but to repeat it? Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile. Not repeat it, perfect it. A forged will, an invented culprit, and a confession obtained under fear. He knew exactly how to make the story fit. He even used the curate's own guilt to seal it. Graves stood, pacing. But if that's true, the evidence is gone. Finch's confession, the will, everything supports his version. We've nothing to prove otherwise. There's always something, Miss Marple said gently. The smallest oversight, a thread caught in the wrong sleeve, a word written by the wrong hand. If I were you, Inspector, I'd compare the handwriting of that so-called confession, found in the loft, with the Colonel's earlier notes. I suspect they'll match rather too neatly. Graves looked at her, astonished. You truly think he forged the confession himself? I think, Miss Marple replied, that men who once deceive for gain rarely forget how. He was gone within minutes, striding toward the inn. Miss Marple remained by the window, watching the path where the Colonel had walked, her thoughts as measured as the ticking of the mantel clock. Time passed, 5 minutes, 10. Then, faintly, from beyond the green, came the distant sound of raised voices. By late afternoon, news reached her door. The colonel had been stopped as he prepared to depart. Among his luggage, Graves had found a collection of sealed envelopes bearing parish crests, letters of donation, deeds, and a second will, cleverly altered in the curate's name. Faced with proof, the man had smiled thinly, said only, "A pity," she noticed, and allowed himself to be taken away. When the inspector returned that evening, Miss Marple was pouring tea. "You were right," he said, shaking his head. Every line of that confession matches his hand. He'd planned it all, set Finch up as the perfect scapegoat. She handed him a cup with a small nod. "Justice, Inspector, is rarely about what is said aloud. It's about listening to the silence around it." He smiled ruefully. "And you, Miss Marple, how did you know?" She looked into her tea, her voice soft and reflective. "Because evil, when it pretends to be righteous, always overplays its humility." He was too gracious, too patient, too ready to let others believe the worst. "I've seen that kind of goodness before. It always smells faintly of guilt." Outside, twilight settled gently over Little Brenton. The harvest feast would be remembered now, not for its laughter, but for the night when a guest vanished and truth, at last, was found hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple drew the curtains and returned to her chair, the firelight warming her face as she resumed her knitting. Somewhere in the village, the church bell chimed softly once more, steady, solemn, and final, as though Little Brenton itself had learned, yet again, that even in the gentlest of places, deceit can grow quietly like ivy on an old stone wall, waiting only for someone wise enough to trace its roots to their beginning. The day after Captain Statham's arrest dawned with a pearly light that made Little Brenton look newly laundered, as though the night's rain had rinsed away something more stubborn than dust. The village woke cautiously, the way one rises from a fever. Shutters opened, kettles sang, and voices kept to a careful softness, as if loudness might crack a fresh glaze upon the morning. In the Bluebell tea-room, even Mrs. Bletchley moderated her conclusions to a murmur, and Mr. Tupper, who usually pronounced on everything from weather to Westminster, confined himself to strange business that, as if strangeness, acknowledged, might return to its kennel. Miss Marple had slept, but her sleep carried the feeling of a finished sum one works through again for the comfort of each figure returning to its place. After breakfast, she set a small basket with broth, a heel of brown bread, and a folded note. The brass cufflink rearing horse, stubborn as pride, she left upon the mantel, a private star to steer by. Then she took the lane to the vicarage. The curate's study had the dispirited neatness of calamity recently tidied. A single chair stood by the window. On its seat lay an unopened letter, the flap broken and resealed with the clumsy care of someone who thinks secrecy a moral act. Mrs. Finch rose at Miss Marple's entrance with that careful dignity exhausted women acquire when they cannot yet afford to fall apart. Her eyes were swollen in the way that comes from not weeping quite enough. "My dear," said Miss Marple, "I have brought broth. Grief and honesty both require feeding." A breath that might have been a laugh or a sob escaped the younger woman. "You are very kind. Everything feels smaller this morning, and somehow heavier." "Small things are weighty when they are ours," Miss Marple said, setting the basket down. "Tell me if you can do so without pain. Did you write to the captain before he came?" Mrs. Finch's fingers tensed upon the chair. "I did, anonymously. The address was in a notice about charitable frauds. I told only what I could bear to say, that a will had been altered and a parish wronged. I thought a stranger might perform the surgery we, my husband and I, could not. And when the stranger arrived and made everything bleed, I tried to mend it with smaller lies. They only tore more." "Small lies are like poor stitches," Miss Marple said gently. "They come out at the very tug meant to hold them." She touched the unopened letter. "And this? From my sister. She says I must leave at once and never look back." Mrs. Finch gave a thin smile, but one always looks back. It is the first place the heart keeps its furniture. Miss Marple squeezed her hand. Go to your sister for a time. Return when you can look your own reflection in the curate's glass without flinching. That will be soon enough, and sooner, I fancy, than you think. She left the vicarage to a noon of thinning cloud. Inspector Graves appeared from the direction of the laurels with a folder under his arm and the restrained relief of a man whose puzzle has ceased resisting its pieces. The forged statements match Stutham's hand, he said without preface. The loft letter, the map, the loft confession, all his. He practiced the curate's signature too, badly, but panic will sell anything dear. Panic is a lavish buyer, Miss Marple agreed, and yet in the end it always leaves the bill behind. Graves glanced back at the inn. He's admitted nothing, only smiled, that disagreeable little smile men use when they wish to call themselves misunderstood. The county men will take him this afternoon. He hesitated, then asked almost shyly, "How did you see him so clearly? I kept thinking we had a tidy ending." You distrusted the tidiness. Tidiness is theatrical, Miss Marple said. It flatters the eye and asks the mind to sign without reading. The harvest feast, the coaxing lanterns, the well-oiled just so those were arrangements, not accidents. Besides, men who have been forgers do not forget their schooling. They only change the copybook. Where the sexton was polishing the brass with a penitential vigor, suggesting recent accounts reconciled in private. Near the porch, a little girl fished a ladybird from a puddle. Miss Marple steadied the saucer leaf with 2 fingers, and the child, serious as a magistrate, nodded her thanks. Graves watched and, with an awkward tenderness, understood. Something about justice Miss Marple never tried to teach in words. That afternoon the constables conveyed Captain Statham away. There was no audience. Little Brenton has good manners about disgrace. The man walked under a sky that could not be bothered to judge him, his valise square at his side, his single cufflink glinting as if to say that pairs are luck and solitude, always is chosen. At the corner he paused and looked not back at Bartholomew's, but at the laurels. It is an interesting thing, the intimacy a liar develops with the rooms where he has rehearsed. Miss Marple thought, with the faintest sadness, that the human creature loves its stages too well. Prayers were said at 6. The hymn was one of the old light and lantern kind, and went more softly than usual, people singing as if to cradle a bruise. Miss Marple, at the aisle's end, bowed her head and thought of Miss Lydia Brown's marigolds, pressed between a Bible's pages by hands that meant their money to grow, into roofs and porridge instead of secrets. Charity, when left to itself, finds its road again. That, she believed, is the nature of honest intentions. Outside, twilight rinsed the green. Mrs. Bletchley intercepted her with a clatter of bracelets and good intentions. "You will think me dreadful, Miss Marple, but I always distrusted that man. Though, of course, one forgives. I shall take a cake to poor Mrs. Finch and not mention a word, which is almost impossible for me and therefore very virtuous. Goodness measured by difficulty is an attractive arithmetic," Miss Marple said, which satisfied Mrs. Bletchley because the phrase sounded like praise and was not untrue. Mr. Tupper touched his cap. "I've had a think," he announced. "A village is like a marrow goes hollow if you don't keep an eye out." "We must keep kinder eyes as well as watchful ones," Miss Marple replied. He blinked, then nodded, as if she had handed him a new tool and the right to use it. Night fell with the gentleness of permission. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and set the cufflink to catch its circle of light. Her knitting lay obedient upon her lap, but for a time the needles were still, while her mind rewound the day to its quiet hinge. A moment by the well when a frightened man might have confessed and did not, and another in a choir loft, where a different frightened man wrote himself into virtue and was caught by his own flourishes. Tragedy, in villages, often begins with a reluctance to be ridiculous. People will risk anything rather than look small in front of their neighbors. She had seen it with the charwoman who hoarded for a grand funeral and forgot to afford her own supper. She had seen it with the bride who lied about a cousin's address and purchased 5 years of estrangement for the price of one undelivered invitation. A knock came energetic. Young, Peter Bletchley stood on the step, hair damp from the mist, clutching a wrapped loaf. "Mum says we accidentally made 2, he announced with the innocence of a messenger who has no opinions about probability. "Accidents," Miss Marple said, taking the warm parcel. "Often smell of butter. Thank your mother and tell her I will apply jam with gratitude." Peter shifted, then blurted, "I wasn't brave at the pond, really. I didn't want to be the one who found a body." "No one wants that," Miss Marple said. "Bravery is not wanting, it is doing. What you did will become easier to remember than your fear. That is the mind's kindness." He smiled, a little braver already, and left. Miss Marple made cocoa, cut the loaf, and found it better than Mrs. Bletchley's claims for it, which was an agreeable surprise. She looked at the cufflink star of brass and thought of pairs sundered and restored. A will returned to its rightful companions, a charity to its purpose, a wife to a self truer than fear. Justice is accomplished, she reflected. One dramatic tug, but by 1,000 small, consistent stitches. From the church came the slow toll of 9, a thoughtful sound settling like a shawl over the green. The ewes stood quiet, the well kept its cool counsel, the mill pond harbored only reeds and a memory of a coat that had not drowned. In one house, a woman addressed a letter in a steady hand, her name plainly written this time, and in another, a man mended a hinge without the practiced innocence with which he had once explained its squeak. These are victories fit for villages, which are suspicious of trumpets and fond of repairs. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The click and whisper returned the room to its proper measure, and the day, having expended its drama, rejoined the ordinary with an audible sigh. She was not elated, elation belongs to young detectives and novelists, but she was content in that deeper way. Contentment sometimes imitates sadness. Little Brenton would remember and forget and misremember in the gentle disorder of communities that prefer comfort to accuracy. Yet the roof would be mended by honest means, and Miss Brown's marigolds would, in next summer's beds, turn their plain faces to the sun. Before bed, she opened the window. The night smelled of wet stone and apple peel. A fox passed on light feet, going about business untroubled by human consequence. Miss Marple reflected, with a mild amusement that had nothing of mockery in it, that criminals are often fastidious housekeepers of their stories, dusting and arranging until all gleams, and that the surest way to untidy their rooms is to look kindly at what they most wish to hide. Kindness, made exacting, sees everything. She drew the curtains and lowered the lamp. On the mantel, the solitary cufflink kept a last ember of borrowed fire, a small, faithful light, like a buoy, marking safe water after a storm. In the morning, she would carry it to the constable with thanks and, perhaps, a seed cake, recipe law and cake. She thought, make better neighbors than law alone. The cottage settled, the clock approved, and the village, mended enough to sleep, folded itself into the sort of long, decent quiet that does not boast of being peace, though it is very like it.